and then Costa Rica.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we can talk about that. Hello, Cherie. I am very happy to welcome you. You are in Costa Rica at the moment, in Montezuma, and I really wanted to have a talk with you so that you can present yourself to a French public. And it was very important to me that you explain how you succeeded to make healthy food that was tasting bad back in the 70s or 80s into something that is succulent at the moment and that can compete with a really tasteful food that we can compare now, light food with normal food. And back 30 years back, it was not possible because it was only for health and people were not enjoying that. So you have a long history, and you have been running the Living Light Culinary Institute for several decades, and now you are retired. And I had the chance to meet you and Dan. So yes, please can you explain us how it started at the beginning? What was your motivation?
Well, thank you, Eric, for giving me the opportunity to speak with people. It's been a long time since I've done any kind of media interviews because, as you say, I've been retired. And it's interesting to me too to go back to the beginning and talk about how it all began. I was a vegetarian and vegan chef in the beginning, and I was a pioneer in that, and I was always known for making healthy living delicious. That was kind of my motto, because I know that if food doesn't taste good, people won't eat it. What's the good of it if it's healthy but nobody's eating it? So I was a lifelong learner. I read a lot of books about health. In the beginning, there weren't a lot of books, but then more and more were written. And then I read a book by Victoria Skobinskis and another by Dr. Ann Wigmore. And I became interested in the fact that they were using only raw and living foods to heal people, all kinds of diseases that nobody really knew could be possible. And so I went to Puerto Rico to one of Dr. Ann Wigmore's clinics, and I experienced for myself what the food was like and how it was healing people. The food was so basic, so simple. Most of the time, 5 ingredients put into a blender that tasted quite bad. But many people were there as a last-ditch effort to become well again. They had cancer, heart disease, diabetes. I saw people come in on a stretcher. I mean, they really had been given a death notice by their doctors, told to go home and put their affairs in order because they were going to die, and there was nothing that medicine could do for them. And so I saw amazing transformations with these people. Literally, people who couldn't walk in were walking down the beach and running up the stairs with a new lease on life from these foods that they were eating. But I also met people had come year after year because they would come and get healed, and then they'd go home to their normal way of life, which meant the foods that they had gotten them there in the first place, who had made them sick to begin with, and they'd have to come back again for another cleansing.
Wow.
All the damage that had been done. And so I realized very quickly that the reason that people were ultimately failing, was that the food that was so healing there tasted so bad that they really couldn't go home and continue to eat that food for the rest of their lives. So because I was the only person there that was actually healthy, and I got to know the staff, I started going up in the middle of the night when everybody was sleeping, going into the kitchen and coming up with some good food, tasty foods, using only the ingredients that they had been giving us for cleansing. And one night, Dr. Ann Wigmore came in. She was an amazing woman, by the way, so healthy and so vibrant and full of life. And she would take a nap during the day. She was in her 80s at that time, so she would take a nap during the day. And so she was up sometimes at night. And she came into the kitchen and she ate some of the food that I was preparing. And she said, "You will be a beacon of light for my teachings because it's good." And it tasted great. I mean, the staff were so happy that I was there because, of course, before that, they were eating the same food that the patients were eating. And for them to be able to eat food that tasted great, some wonderful salad dressings, even put on their normal salad, but with taste sauces and some delicious dehydrated cookies and different foods. I really hadn't even had a chance yet to fully explore what my cuisine would become at that point. But it's so that Ann Wigmore was impressed and the staff was happy, and I knew that I was onto something. So when I left Ann Wigmore Institute, I went home, and for 3 months, I did nothing but prepare raw living foods. I sprouted. I learned how to make dehydrated foods. I made foods that were people-pleasing foods that everybody loves. In the United States at the time, people loved things like tacos and hamburgers and lasagna, a lot of international foods, actually. And I figured out how I could make them really delicious. And I had a following of students from all over the world because I had been teaching at vegetarian and vegan conferences that were international. And so as soon as I started teaching these raw living food courses, I had an automatic audience of people who were interested in where's Cherie going next with her culinary art.
Yeah.
And so I started teaching classes at the international conferences, vegetarian and vegan conferences that I had been teaching at all along. And they were standing room only classes. Everybody loved the food, and I was very motivated to continue on. So I started writing a cookbook, and I started doing a few international classes, as I said. And Victoria Skolinskas invited me to teach, not just teach, but to cater a week-long women's retreat in Arkansas. And I did that. And afterwards, he sat me down and he said, "You must teach chefs what you're doing here, because everyone in the world should know how to prepare food like this. It could save the planet." And he was a mentor of mine. I believed in him so strongly. I took his words seriously and decided to start a culinary school. At that point, I had written Angel Foods, Healthy Recipes, Heavenly Bodies, and it was half recipes of raw food and half cooked food, because at that point, no publisher was interested in publishing a book of all raw living food. They said to me, when I submitted the recipe book manuscript, they said, nobody wants to eat raw food. And also because it had a little bit of a spiritual content to it. She doesn't know whether this is a spiritual book or a recipe book. And to me, we're not just physical. We're physical, emotional, and spiritual. And I tried to always bring that element into food. So I think people can taste love in food. And so when it's prepared consciously, then you can taste it, you can feel it in your body. I decided, like within 2 weeks of the time that Vic Forrest gave me this mandate that I had to teach chefs, I created what I called Living Light Culinary Institute. And I called it Living Light because of what Dr. Ann had said to me, saying, "You will be a beacon of light for my teachings." And so I, what things? And wanted to really follow through and become her beacon of light. And for the next many years, that's all I taught. I stopped teaching cooking classes altogether. I started teaching at some different retreat centers. I would rent a retreat center for a month and train chefs. And I had to bring in everything required to train chefs. I met my husband, Dan, sometime after I started the school, and he is a technological wizard. And so he brought in overhead cameras, so we had television, and we really set up schools in retreat centers. We bought a refrigerated trailer because no retreat center had enough refrigeration for the amount of fresh raw food that we were feeding our chefs. And many of those chefs, by the way, became really well-known chefs and started food industries of their own, wrote a lot of cookbooks, and started some lines of raw food, even frozen raw food, dehydrated raw food. And so it became really started spreading quite quickly. After, I guess, 5 or 6 years of doing it that way, we realized that it was getting to be too big for us. And so we started a permanent location in the city, in the town, small town that we lived in on the California coast. And we had been surveying people for many years, asking them if they didn't come to this retreat center, where else would they go to learn what we had to share with them? And they all said, we'll go wherever you are. And so that's why we realized that we could bring them to a small town in Northern California, and we could have a thriving school. And
so at the beginning, you were traveling. At the beginning, you were traveling, preparing food on events. And it was at the second time, but you started the physical school.
Yes, we were, in the beginning, we traveled. Well, of course, we were still doing talks and demonstrations and different locations around the world in conferences, but we also were traveling to retreat centers for this, temporary chef training, places in Oregon and California, wherever people would have us. And then after quite a few years, I guess when we started, it must have been about 5 or 6 years, we started our permanent location in Fort Bragg, California. And we also opened up a cafe and a culinary store because the students didn't know where, especially students in other countries, didn't know where could they buy a dehydrator, where could they buy a juicer, and the kinds of things that they were going to need to support a raw living food diet. And we started a cafe so that people in our community could taste how delicious the food was, and then they would understand why we were teaching people how to prepare. We had people coming from all over California and stocking up on our food and taking it home so that they could have it at home and share it with their friends. We had the whole police force coming in and eating our desserts instead of eating at the donut shop next door. They would get their over there, and then they would come into our cafe to get our delicious desserts. And they would always say, well, no desserts can really compare to your desserts because cooking takes all the flavor out of it. And so we were quite a popular cafe in our community. And then we had students come from over 65 different countries.
Wow.
Learn how to prepare this delicious food that nourished the body and nurtured the spirit. Because we don't eat just for the taste of the food. They also eat because it makes them feel good for a long period of time. Food that is not healthful makes you feel good when you're eating it just because it's satisfying when you're eating it, but then you feel terrible and sometimes even guilty, badly, for having eaten it. But when they're eating this delicious, life-saving, life-affirming food, they feel like their body feels good. It feels nurtured as well as nourished.
Okay. And how was it? Because at the beginning you started teaching to mainstream persons, and at some point you really became a chef school that specialized for persons who wanted to open their own restaurant, open their own retreat center, open their own health center. So this was more at the end of this period, or you started training chefs from the really beginning?
We started training chefs right from the beginning. Of course, the kind of curriculum, the professional curriculum, we weren't licensed by the state of California to train professional chefs in the beginning. That came later. it takes years to build up the reputation and all of the professional material, stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of manifestos for the professional world. And so it took us some time to do that. But the mandate that Victoris gave me in those early days, I would say that must have been in 1997, was to train chefs. And I had already training home, moms and dads and even young people before that. So it was the mandate was to train chefs. So when I opened the school, it was with that intention. And so by the time we opened up the permanent location in California, we already had quite a body of material, knowing what kinds of foods the public really loved and what kind of teaching methods would really be efficient and effective for the average person who maybe many of them came in not even knowing how to cook because they didn't like cooking, but they learned that they did like preparing raw foods. And so we learned a lot before we actually opened the permanent location. And then we were able to build on that. And it wasn't until maybe, I don't know, at least 8 years later that we were able to obtain licensing from the state of California. And at the time, we were the only raw vegan culinary school in the world, and certainly the only one that ever even applied for such a thing in the state of California. And the state of California has very high standards, probably the highest in the world. So we had to, we say, jump through a lot of hoops in order to get that kind of licensing. And once we had that, then we realized that we needed to put this training online. So at that point, we had a lot of material. We know exactly, like for every single demonstration, every single thing that was needed for every demonstration, for every single recipe. And we had hundreds of recipes that needed to build upon for somebody to learn before they could really have the skills, the chef skills, to be able to open a restaurant, write a cookbook, and teach others. Because not only were we training chefs, but we were also training teachers, because we want this to go all over the world, not only to people who could go into a restaurant and eat the food, but for people to be able to prepare the food at home for their families and their children. And obviously, we couldn't teach enough people one-on-one, even going into these big conferences. We needed to be able to have teachers out there, an army of teachers teaching others. And it wasn't until I really felt we had that I felt confident to retire, because I felt like now we have an army of teachers and we have thousands and thousands of people out there who know how to make raw living foods delicious. And now I can relax a little bit and let them do the work and let them out and teach. And it's kind of like, I feel like I threw one little pebble in a pond and all the little ripples went out and made the waves for the rest of the pond. And it was very gratifying.
Yeah, this is wonderful. I went through all your material and, well, there are several things I have to say. The first thing is you are incredibly precise in making the recipes, and what I appreciate. The first thing is you are super precise with the ingredients, with the way to handle everything. And also, you give always options. I mean, if somebody doesn't have the exact ingredient, they can replace it, and you always give options to adapt the recipe because sometimes more ingredients may be a bit tricky to find. And the other thing that was impressing me is that you have a whole ethnic course. So you made Italian raw food, you made French raw food, you made Mexican raw food. So you really, I can feel inside these courses that you really wanted also to adapt yourself to the different ethnic cuisines that are existing. So but this is really a nice thing. And yeah, with the image of the people, I guess you succeeded. I can tell you because, well, I don't know, when you retired in 2016, no, now 16?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the people you have been launching is still making waves now, and there are still more people proposing raw living foods. I think you were a really pioneer at that time because the vegan movement was not so strong as it is now. And because I guess people were coming to vegan food due to health issues, not for environmental concern. Mm-hmm. And I guess now all the young people who are, leaving school and being in their 20s, 25, 30s, they have a much more stronger environmental concern than we had in our generations. Mm-hmm. And they chose this way of eating also for the environment. But this was not the first domino in these years when you started all that. So, yeah, it was really a visionary, a pioneer, and yes. So what we do in France, we really try to make a big wave, not a little wave like this. Yeah, we are really blessed that we could dive into new material and to make it available in other languages. And I hope that when we do so, maybe one time it will be available in Spanish or in German or in Italian or whatever, because it's really will be nice for more people to get their hands on everything you have been teaching during all these years. Can you recall me how many years this whole story lasted, more or less, for you?
I would say, well, I opened the school, I think in 1998.
Okay.
I was teaching, started teaching raw vegan food, I think in 1994, perhaps. And so we had the school for years.
Okay.
And of course, I was teaching, much longer. I've been teaching plant-based foods for 50 years. I'm 77. So
wow.
I've been teaching for a long time. And right. As far as international foods are concerned, I've traveled the world, and I have a palate that really requires a lot of flavor. And I've been able to learn from different chefs through my life. And in fact, one of the main, I would say, educators that I've had were my own students, because they did come from all over the world, and they brought their recipes with them. And they would sometimes ask me, how can I make a raw borscht? Work together. Over the years, we created new classes. Besides just the 3-week chef training class, we added things, teacher training, of course, and different kinds of international classes specifically to work with some of these students who had come from places like Uganda. I mean, places that Lithuania that I would never have expected to have there. And so they brought their own flavors and textures and spices and expectations. And so we had recipe development classes, and we had food photography classes, and we had a lot of fun. I mean, food, it has to be fun too, or people. It has to make them feel good. It has to satisfy the senses, and it has to be fun to prepare. And so we always tried to keep this in with when we prepared our online classes. We tried to keep it fun and light, and as you said, giving different kinds of substitutions and options for them, because not everybody has the same ingredient. They may not have eggplant in Thailand. Well, actually, they do have eggplant in Thailand, but it looks different than it does in Europe, for example. And so we did incorporate different kinds of options, and also seasons change. And so you have to be able to create these recipes in different seasons. And so zucchini may be, really may grow a lot of zucchini in the summer, but not in the winter. And options. And you'll find that on the online classes. I know you have.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so yes, this is really this is the highest quality material I could find in the world, being in that industry also for 20 years now. And having been a bit the pioneer in France to introduce like food in France back in the beginning of the 2000 years. So I'm very thankful for all the work you did, the time you dedicated when we met in Costa Rica 2 times. And I'm really proud that I can release your job now in France because it's not the easiest country to release this kind of material, because we have such a strong culinary culture. But I'm very happy, and we do our best to make a tsunami out of it.
You have worked really hard to bring this to France, and I really, really appreciate the beautiful job you've done with my training, because somebody could have done it very quickly and just worked through it quickly and not really put the same kind of effort into translating it and making it available as we put into creating it in the first place. And so I'm really so grateful to you both. Really going the extra 1,000 miles available to the world, because it's a great gift. And I do really appreciate that it's not just going to, go into a library somewhere and not continue to make huge waves in the world. Because I know that's
Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot, Cherie, for all your time. I hope we meet one time soon again when we come to Costa Rica. And we'll give you good news of the launch and all the enthusiasm that it triggers in France.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
With pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.